these three together because it's pretty clear that they went out together. Now, I think there's a good argument to be made that the Ephesian letter probably went out at the same time and was probably carried to Ephesus on the way to Colossae and Laodicea. But that was more than I cared to cover in one night, and I had another reason for wanting to do Ephesians separately. And so we're going to do it in a separate class, but it's not going to be next week. Next week is our gospel meeting. We'll be in the fellowship hall. We're in the fellowship hall, Daniel. We'll be in the auditorium next Wednesday night for our gospel meeting. And then the following week, I'll be out of town, but Jason has agreed to teach our class that week. So May the 7th, we'll have a guest teacher, and I'll let him teach whatever he decides he wants to teach. And then we will resume our studies, Lord willing, the following week after that. But tonight I wanted to look at these letters to Colossae, Laodicea, and Philemon. And right off the bat, you may notice that we're dealing with two cities and an individual. The cities of Colossae and Laodicea were located in the Lycus River Valley. And let's talk a little bit about that river because it's located in sort of western central Asia Minor. It was at this point in history a part of the Roman province of Asia. And so, for example, when we get to the book of Revelation and John is writing to the 7 churches of Asia, he's talking here about the Roman province of Asia, and included among those 7 churches is Laodicea. And so we know that the church in Laodicea got letters from at least 2 apostles, one being John and the other being Paul. Although, if you look in the table of contents for your New Testament, you will not find an epistle to the Laodiceans. Anybody want to venture a guess as to why that is?
Wasn't it lost?
Yeah, we don't have it. It wasn't preserved for us. Evidently, in the wisdom of God, there was not something that necessarily we had to have that we didn't have in the other scriptures that were preserved for us, because we know that He's given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, and that through the scriptures we are thoroughly equipped to all good works. So we don't have to worry that there's something lost that we need. The Lord saw fit to preserve the things that we needed, but He did not, for whatever reason, preserve the letter to the Laodiceans. And in fact, even in very old writings, there is reference to the fact that the letter to the Laodicean church evidently was lost quite early on. Now, you get a few centuries out from the life of Paul, and all of a sudden there begin to be popping up some letters to the church at Laodicea, written in Latin, oddly enough. And if you begin to look at them, it becomes quite readily apparent that they're forgeries for various different reasons. One of the most prominent of them that actually was included in a number of Catholic Bibles for a number of years was mainly composed of excerpts from the letter to the Philippians. Just a very sort of superficial look at that letter to the Laodiceans would let you know right quick, hey, wait a minute, this sounds really familiar. And not familiar in the same way that Colossians and Ephesians sound familiar. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But again, there are no Greek manuscripts of these letters to the Laodiceans, which leads us to believe that the letter to the Laodicean church was lost very early on. Now, some of the ancient historians mention that there was a major earthquake in the Lycus River Valley around 61 CE. And if that is true, it might very well explain the loss of that letter. It also may very well explain the demise of the city of Colossae. Because while Colossae is described in some early writings, pre-New Testament writings, as having been a thriving, flourishing, wealthy city, by New Testament times it was not very prominent, certainly not compared with Laodicea, for example, just a little farther down the valley that was much more prosperous than Colossae was. And I think there's an explanation for why that is. And so it may have been on the decline, Colossae may have been, at the time that Paul wrote to it. And some have suggested that this earthquake, sometime after Paul wrote his letter, may have essentially spelled the end of the city that we knew as Colossae. Now, archaeologists have been able to locate and unearth some remains of the old city of Colossae, but it's very apparent that it suffered from earthquake, which was not uncommon in that part of the world. All right, now, we talk about the Lycus River Valley, and when we start kind of in the southeast of the river valley, we start with Mount Cadmus, and at the foot of Mount Cadmus is the location of the city of Colossae. And the Lycus River, which is honestly a little bit more like a creek, you can see a picture of it there on the screen, comes up out of the ground right near Colossae, and it travels through the valley. It branches a few times and comes back into itself, and then empties into the famous Meander River. So where we get our English word meandering, like the meanderings of a river, that's where it comes from. It empties into the Meander River, and in this river valley are these three cities, Colossae, and then about 9 miles or so, sort of to the northwest, is Laodicea on one side of the Lycus River and Hierapolis on the other side. Hierapolis was kind of the Gatlinburg of that part of the world. It was a tourist attraction. It was a tourist attraction primarily because it was filled with warm baths that had mineral content that was widely believed to have healing properties. And so people would go there to soak in the mineral baths and to seek healing and things like that, but it was very much a tourist city. And I've wondered sometimes in noticing the conspicuous absence of any letter to Hierapolis when it's right across the river, about 6 miles from Laodicea. And yet we have 2 apostolic letters that we know of to Laodicea and 1 to Colossae. I wonder sometimes if perhaps the church in Hierapolis, if there was one, might not have been very, very small. And the reason I say that is even today, if you visit a heavily tourist area and you find a congregation of the Lord's people there, if you look at the board that gives the number of attendance, it's going to be pretty deceiving if you look at Sunday morning attendance. If you want to see the people who actually live there and are actually part of the week-to-week work of the church, look at the Wednesday night attendance. That'll give you a better idea. And a lot of times that attendance will be about 1/10 or less of what comes on Sunday morning because you have a lot of tourists passing through on the weekends, right? And maybe Hierapolis was somewhat like that. I don't know, just a guess. But at any rate, Paul writes this letter that we have preserved as Colossians, and in chapter 4 he makes mention of the fact that he's also writing a letter to Laodicea, and he expects the churches in Colossae and Laodicea, after they have read his letters to them, to swap letters, and each of them read the letter to the other church in their assembly, so that they can receive what Paul sent. So you've got this Lycus River Valley, you've got these 3 cities, and they're quite wealthy. And their wealth derives primarily from the wool industry. Wool is very plentiful here because pastures, lush, fertile pastures, are very plentiful. And so the sheep can graze and they can grow healthy and they can grow thick, heavy wool, which could then be harvested. And apparently there was something in the mineral content of the Lycus River that was especially conducive to dyeing wool. And so it wasn't just pure wool that was harvested and sent out, but it was dyed wool, and it was especially known for 2 particular colors. One was a purple wool that had been named after Colossae, and then there was a black wool, black dyed wool, that was sent out from Laodicea in particular. And it would travel down a very well-used trade route that ran east to west across Asia Minor. Typically, it would probably go to the west, excuse me. I'm backwards up here. It would go to the west, probably to one of the port cities on the port of the Aegean Sea, and from there be shipped across the Mediterranean to various different places. Okay? So you have this wool industry. It's a major trade route then that intersects the city of Laodicea, and it's coming out of this valley and making these cities quite wealthy. Now, there's a pretty significant Jewish population in the Lycus River Valley. And historians lead us to believe that the Jewish population probably at least originated with a major deportation that took place at the hands of Antiochus the Great, Antiochus III. Remember, he was the father of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who caused all the problems for the Jews and led to the Maccabean revolt. Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great, had deported a large body of Jews into what became the Roman province of Asia and probably settled them here in the Lycus River Valley. Now, last week when we were talking about Philippi, we noticed the conspicuous absence of a large Jewish population there. And we noted that it's interesting that that coincides with the absence of there being a very thriving commercial trade in Philippi. Philippi was very much a government city, not nearly so much a commercial city. But the opposite is true here in the Lycus River Valley. You have the commerce that springs up around the textile trade. And the Jewish people would have done quite well if commerce was their practice in that kind of an environment. And sure enough, it does seem that there was a pretty healthy population of Jews in this area. Now, one other interesting note on this area before we move into something more specific is that every indication in the letter to the Colossians and the letter to Philemon is that Paul had never personally visited these cities. We know that twice he would have passed within the vicinity on his second and his third missionary journeys, but it seems that he traveled essentially to the north of the Lycus River Valley and never actually came down into the Lycus River Valley, so that he mentions in the letter to the Colossians that they had not seen his face. And in the letter to Philemon, he mentions wanting to come and see Philemon, who we believe lived in Colossae. Okay? So let's talk for a moment about this Laodicean epistle. As I said a moment ago, it's mentioned in Colossians 4:16, where Paul instructs the church at Colossae to swap letters with the Laodicean church. That's really all we know about it. We have no idea what the contents were. Some scholars suggest that what is alluded to here as the letter to Laodicea may be what we know as the letter to the Ephesians. And their argument is that the Ephesian letter was intended to be cyclical. That is, it was intended to be passed around. I think that's based primarily on conjecture. I don't know how in the world you would ever prove or disprove that theory. But it's interesting that some suggest that the letter to the Laodiceans is actually what we have as the letter to the Ephesians. My hunch is that that's maybe wishful thinking, wishing that we had a way to see what was in the letter to the Laodiceans. If we want to know, we can ask when we get to heaven, along with 5,726,921 other things that I plan to ask about. All right? We don't know. We don't know anything about it. As I said a moment ago, most of the letters we have that purport to be the Laodicean epistle are what we call pseudepigraphal epistles. False. Written under a false epigraph. All right? So let's dive into the one we do know. The Colossian epistle, as I said a moment ago, is written by Paul, who says as much that he had not visited the church there. He also alludes to the fact in chapter 4, verses 3 and 18, that he's in prison when he writes it. Now, a couple of things sort of begin to gel together here. We know from our study last week that when Paul wrote the Philippian letter, he was in prison, and most likely in prison in Rome, because of mentions he makes of Caesar's household and the Praetorian Guard and people of that nature that would have most naturally been located in Rome. Did he write the Colossian letter from Rome as well? Most likely. I say most likely because if you remember your history from the book of Acts, Paul was in prison for a long time even before he got to Rome. He was in prison for some years in Caesarea from the arrest that originated in Jerusalem before he ever got put on the ship to Rome, and then eventually went to Rome and was imprisoned there for a while. So there's a long time during which Paul is imprisoned, and there's really nothing in these letters that we can latch on to and say for sure Paul wrote these letters at this particular time during his imprisonment. All we know is that he alludes to being in prison. So did he write them from Caesarea? Maybe. I can't rule it out as a possibility. I do think it's probably good inference to say that Paul probably wrote the letter to the Colossians and the letter to the Ephesians pretty close together. If for no other reason than because topically, in a lot of ways, they're twins. Think about how many parallel passages we have between Ephesians and Colossians. You have the whole section about husbands and their wives, masters and their slaves, about the church singing and teaching and admonishing and making melody in their hearts one to another. You have sections like that read very much alike, where Paul is giving very much the same exhortations, just in very synonymous terms. On the other hand, there is a particular uniqueness to each of those letters. And there are some things that Paul writes about to the Colossian church that he doesn't mention to the Ephesians. Primarily, evidently, because he has got some knowledge about what's going on in the Colossian church. Well, let's ask the question, where did he get that information? He's not visited the church, he says that. Well, he tells us in the Colossian letter that a man by the name of Epaphras has come and visited him and given him an account of the church in Colossae. Epaphras seems to have been a man who was very heavily involved in the work with the Colossian church. And it also seems that perhaps Epaphras might have even been the one who brought the gospel to Colossae. At any rate, it seems that Epaphras is deeply involved with the work. Maybe he's the one who's preaching for them. And he has come to visit Paul in his imprisonment. That would probably lend itself to Paul having been in Rome, just because nobody really knew how long to expect Paul to be in Caesarea. He appealed to Caesar, and he could be put on a ship at any point. But at any rate, Epaphras has come to Paul. He's told him about the church in Colossae, and Paul writes some things that seem to be responsive to a threat that the church in Colossae may be facing from without. Now, I say from without because Paul's way of addressing it is very different from the way he addressed the problems that were going on, for example, in the Corinthian church. In the Corinthian church, he is outright reprimanding the Corinthian Christians for some things they are doing. Whereas in the Colossian letter, when he takes on issues with false doctrine, it seems that he's warning them against those who would seek to come in and pollute them, rather than something that's already blooming and blossoming and bearing fruit within the church. Now, he talks about something that has been referred to in the literature as a Colossian heresy. Does anybody know what we're talking about here in a nutshell? Well, you remember he talks about not being spoiled by philosophy and by things like will worship and vain deceits of men. This is in chapter 2. And he's warning them against these sorts of things. It's also interesting to me that Paul seems to put a very heavy emphasis in the letter to the Colossians on the superiority of Jesus the Christ, but also on the fact that Jesus came bodily in the flesh, and that he dwelt bodily in the flesh with all the fullness of the Godhead as well. In other words, he seems to emphasize 2 or 3 times by careful selection of words that Christ was both God and man, and that he actually dwelt in the flesh, and that the presence of both of those elements is essential to the validity of the gospel. Now, we know that Paul doesn't use words lightly. And if ever there's a wordsmith in the New Testament, Paul is the one, and he likes to select his words to fit a very particular need and apply them to a very particular need. Now, why would he seem to emphasize both the deity of Jesus and the fact that the deity of Jesus dwelt actually in his physical fleshly body? Unless that was the subject, perhaps, of some false teaching. Now, somebody immediately says, well, that's got to be Gnosticism, because the Docetic Gnostics, of course, taught that Jesus didn't actually come in the flesh. He simply seemed or appeared to come in the flesh, because flesh is sinful and spirit is pure. Any problem with that line of argument, Greg?
It seems more like masochism or something. I mean, because in chapter 2, when he's talking about, don't, what's the language? It says,
neglecting the body and that sort of thing?
well, an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body.
Yeah. So an ascetic sort of an element as well to it. Yeah.
Demanding that if you're not an ascetic,
Okay.
you don't have real faith or something like that.
That's right. And that certainly seems to be an element of it as well, which interestingly enough was not so much an element of Docetic Gnosticism. In fact, the other extreme seemed to be an element of Docetic Gnosticism. They said, hey, if flesh is inherently evil and spirit is inherently pure and the two don't mingle together, as long as your spirit stays pure, you can do about what you want to with your body. At least that seemed to be part of their argument. The problem with assigning this to Gnosticism, aside from the doctrinal mismatch, and I think you're exactly right in pointing that out, is that it's anachronistic. Docetic Gnosticism doesn't come to be as a doctrine per se until the 3rd century. Could it be the forebears of thought? Absolutely, it could be. Because it seems that the Gnosticism that really racked the church in the 2nd and 3rd centuries was rooted in Greek mystery religion. And certainly these folks were part and parcel of the culture from which Greek mystery religion sprang. And so sure, it could be what some have called incipient Gnosticism. In other words, it hadn't come to full-fledged doctrinal, systemized belief, but the thought processes are there. But you're exactly right. This idea of asceticism is obviously an element that he's combating, because these people seem to be teaching that in order to be pious, you have to deprive yourself, or maybe even worse, punish yourself. And of course, we know of various different monastic orders through the years who have practiced various different kinds of asceticism, either going off and living as a hermit, or extreme types of fasting, or self-flagellation and things of that nature, none of which have any grounding in the doctrine of Christ. And that's what Paul's arguing here. So there is evidently an element of false teaching that's going on here. And this is not just your run-of-the-mill Judaizing that goes on in some of the other places that Paul has to deal with. This is a peculiar thing. And it's definitely on my list of things to ask more about when I get to heaven. But Paul does seem to be addressing some potential for being led into error by the Colossian church. All right? Good points. Let's talk for a moment about the letter to Philemon. This is a personal letter. And one of my favorite in the New Testament, because it is Paul at his finest as a writer. Every little word, every little turn of phrase, every almost, I wanted to say punctuation mark, but there's no punctuation in the ancient Greek manuscripts. The point I'm making, of course, is that Paul goes to painstaking detail in this letter to get his point across in the finest way possible. And what's the gist of the letter to Philemon? What is Paul wanting Philemon to do?
Forgive and return Onesimus.
Okay. Onesimus is someone who belongs to the household of Philemon, maybe belongs in the sense of a servant. Paul says as much, right? And some sort of a rift has happened between Philemon and Onesimus. Many have inferred that Onesimus had wronged Philemon in some way, maybe stolen from him, and had fled from him and runs into Paul in Rome. Paul converts Onesimus. He says, I fathered him in my chains, and then sends him back. And he is one of the group who brings the Colossian letter to the Colossian church, but he is also the subject of the letter to Philemon, where Paul is, as eloquently as Paul ever writes, begging for Philemon not only to forgive Onesimus, and to restore him to fellowship. But if I read it correctly, he's wanting him to send Onesimus back to Paul to work with him in somewhat a similar vein as men like Epaphroditus and Timothy and Titus and others. And he says, I would not do this without your assent. And yet Paul puts about every possible way that he could apply social pressure to Philemon in that letter. He does it without outright commanding him to do what he wants him to do. And he even goes so far as to say, I could, as an apostle, command you to do this, but I'd rather beg. Which kind of says, hey, you better do this, right? Beautiful little letter. But now notice what happens in the letter about Onesimus. If Christians practice the principles that Paul teaches in this letter to Philemon, what will happen to the institution of slavery? It'll dissolve in fairly short order, won't it? When Christians view those who are slaves as potential brothers in Christ, as people made in the image and likeness of God, the same as I am, as a brother beloved and not merely as a servant, to borrow Paul's language, as potential assets to the church who have their own talents and abilities and interests, who, if they were turned loose to use those talents and abilities and interests in the service of the church, could do great things for the glory of God, what argument do they have to keep holding those people as slaves? There's really not much of one, is there? And so I would argue that contrary to one of the major criticisms of the letter to Philemon, that Paul is acquiescing to the institution of slavery, I would argue that Paul is planting the seeds that would spell destruction to the institution of slavery. But he's doing it by persuading the free will of people rather than issuing an edict. And isn't that really how Christianity works in the first place? What did Jesus say? Go into all the world and convert them at the point of a sword? No, that's Islam, right? Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth, wait a minute, do you believe at the point of a sword? No. You believe when you're persuaded. You may acquiesce at the point of a sword, but you're under compulsion. You're not doing it of your free will. You're under duress. You're being made to do it on pain of death, potentially. That's not persuasion. But the apostles throughout and Jesus always taught the doctrine of persuasion. Go and persuade them of the truth. In fact, isn't it interesting that when Paul's in chains before Agrippa in Acts 22, Agrippa interrupts Paul and says, you almost persuade me to be a Christian. He knew what Paul was after there, didn't he? And Paul's response is, I wish you weren't almost, but altogether, just like me, except for these chains. The doctrine of Christianity is a doctrine of persuasion. And that applies both on the macro scale, trying to get people persuaded of the truth of the gospel, but also on the micro scale in the application of Christian principles into our daily lives. I'm not going to stand here and hold a gun to your head and tell you to do good to the poor and the widows and the orphans. I'm going to try to persuade your heart to believe that that's what God would have you to do. That's what would bring honor and glory to God, and that's how the heart of God operates. And when you are persuaded, I don't have to police you. I don't have to police you in doing it because you believe it, right? So these beautiful letters, I wish we had time to get more into the text, but these are letters that are designed to persuade and to develop the minds of Christians. All right, so 2 weeks from now, Lord willing, I'm going to try to cover Ephesians and 1 Timothy, and you may think that's a weird pairing, but wait till we get there, and I think I can explain why we're doing that. Thank you for your attention.